So we all know what it's like to put hours into sermon prep only to give the sermon and to see a crowd of people who are disengaged. And so today on Practical Church Planting, we're going to give you 7 tips for keeping people engaged during your sermon.
Well, thanks for joining us again today on Practical Church Planting. We're going to be giving you 7 tips for more engaging sermons.
We all want to preach more engaging sermons.
We do.
But before we get into that, we have a really special announcement that we will try to do this briefly
Yes.
so we can get into the content. If you're part of the Practical Church Planting Facebook group or on our newsletter, you'll know that we recently said that we were going to be creating an online course around how to grow your launch team.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that is very helpful and practical if you are planting a church. Now, why this is relevant is if you want to get in on the launch team for the launch team course, you will need to go to practicalplanting.com/launch. There you'll have all the information, frequently asked questions about what this course is about, who it's for. We want to let you know, though, to get on the launch team, it's a limited time, and it's $49. Once the course is released and is live, it'll be at $149.
Yes.
So to get on the launch team, you get the first access once we finish the course. You'll also be able to provide feedback to make it better and all that sort of thing. And so all that to say, if you are in the pre-launch phase of wanting to plant a church and you are needing highly practical advice on how to grow a launch team, practicalplanting.com/launch. Check it out before you can't get in on the early bird price.
Yes. Check it out as soon as possible. And it's we chose it because we did a little survey in the group of what's the people's biggest need. And the biggest need by pretty far was growing a launch team.
And just talking to people.
Yep. I was saying we've been there.
More than fundraising.
Yep.
Because if you have people, then you have the ability to do all the other things.
A lot of other things, yep.
So practicalplanting.com, again, /launch. You get on the launch team, get the early price. You'll get first access to it. I had someone reach out to me and said, hey, and really respectfully was like, can you just share your credentials so I should know if I should invest in this or not? And I shared with him, my experiences, whatever, but I would just say this. The best way to answer the question, should I invest in this course or not? 2 things. One, as we say, free is not always better. So
True.
You got to have to invest in things that matter. But 2, if you like the Practical Church Planting podcast, so let's be your judge. If you like this podcast, the course will be a more in-depth deep dive, and it'll be focused just on one topic as opposed to, we do stuff on preaching and serve teams and generosity, all that sort of thing. This is just launch team. It'll be more in depth. And if you find this podcast to be one that you like only listen to if all your other podcasts don't have a new episode, then that's not it. But if you like this podcast, it will be even better. And so I would say that's your judge. If you are in the pre-launch phase and you get a lot out of this podcast, you will get even more out of the launch team course. And again, it's just going to be highly practical of what to do to get people on board, to grow your team, to launch a church that thrives.
Yes. Practicalplanting.com/launch.
That's right. Go check it out.
Go check it out.
Now, into today's episode, how to preach more engaging sermons. This is something we all want to do.
Yes.
Recently, I had a handful of people send me their sermons in the Practical Church Planting community just to give them feedback on. And so here are some things that I see often and some things that, stuck out to me from that and some things that we have to remind ourselves.
Yeah.
Me and Brian have to remind ourselves as well. So
All
if
the
you're
time.
wanting to preach more engaging sermons, here's what you should do. Number 1 is you want to start your sermon with a story or an illustration or something engaging. And this is vitally important because the first 2 minutes, I don't even know if you'll get 2 minutes, but the first 2 minutes is the only time that everybody is listening. And so if you quote unquote waste that time, which I know it's not wasteful, but you know what I mean, with introducing who you are, giving church announcements, welcoming people, that doesn't give people a reason to keep listening, particularly those who are new or who are invited and don't know you and don't know the church and may not really want to be there. If you want to keep people's attention, you've got to start with something engaging right away. If you want to introduce yourself or welcome people, whatever, do it after the intro, story, or illustration. Of course, the story or illustration should connect to your sermon.
Yeah.
But you want to start right away with something engaging or you will lose people right from the beginning.
Yeah, one thing to say kind of right off the bat is we've said this in the past, but you could probably give us a famous, or maybe not famous, but very well-known and good speaker that doesn't do a lot of these things. And And I say that because just like, for instance, just recently I was listening to a message by Matt Chandler, the Village Church, and this first one he didn't do. He started with something else. And I've heard people say that kind of stuff before, but one thing to keep in mind is that like us, Dylan and I, most of us listening are not in this
Yeah.
world-class echelon of speakers, and so and haven't been doing this obviously for decades and things like that. So with this point and with a lot of them, you could probably point out someone who is obviously a very gifted and effective speaker and preacher and doesn't do these things. But what we're trying to do is what's going to be the most effective for someone who probably in all likelihood isn't in the top 1% of people in the world, really, and communicators. And so starting with this story, it helps people engage right off the bat. It helps people kind of connect with you before just giving them content. And I don't know. I think it's really helpful, especially coming out of, at least the way we do, most of us coming out of worship. It gives people something to connect to before you really get into the message.
Yeah, it gives people a reason to keep listening. Mm-hmm. We have an episode somewhere way back about different places that you can put your announcements in the service. This is probably the worst place to put them, especially if you're a smaller church and you've got worship leader and you're doing the preaching, everything. It might feel weird to do your announcements or your next steps, as we call them, somewhere else. But starting your sermon with announcements, even if you say before I get started, let me just that's the beginning. So do not start with church announcements. Again, if you have new people there and you want to introduce yourself, that's fine. Start with a story and then introduce yourself. It's just like I first heard this from John Acuff a couple years ago, and it's just been like, this is true. It's like you go to a rock concert, for example, or whatever. He had a rock concert example, and imagine the person coming out and say, "Hey guys, thanks for being here. I'm so glad you made the trip." It's like that's not what they do. They have smoke and screens and sounds, and obviously you're preaching a sermon and you're not doing a concert. But the same principle applies. You want to engage people from it right away so that they'll keep listening to you as you preach.
And this is one of the topics that we all wish kind of we could just say just preach the gospel and that's all you need to do. But we want to connect with people, and people need to, if they're listening to you, they need to be able to connect with you to be able to receive the gospel, to really hear what you're trying to tell them. And so these may not all seem like the most spiritual things, and that's not really the point of this episode. But if you want to be able to engage people throughout however long your message is, and you really need to engage them right off the front, because honestly, if you can't engage them right off the bat, it's going to be real difficult to reel them in later.
Yep. And this is hard. I mean, again, you have different convictions or thoughts on this.
Yep.
But this, if you follow this principle, some people might be like to start by saying, "Hey, if you have a Bible, go ahead and open here," and you want to start with reading the scripture first. Again, you can do that. That might not be the most engaging, which you can trade off if you want engaging with something else. Totally fine. But when we're talking just about engaging people in your sermon, if you start with anything other than a story or an illustration, personal stories are always best. You're going to lose people quicker than if you give them a reason to keep listening along.
Yeah.
So that's number one. Number two is to practice out loud beforehand. Recently read a book, TED Talks by Chris Anderson, whatever his name is.
Anderson.
He's the guy who runs them. And interestingly enough, that's one of the things that a lot of these people say is that they practice it out loud beforehand. Of course, doing that actually allows you to know how long it's going to be.
Yeah.
They talk about how it's really lazy, and they get frustrated when people are like doing their presentations and they're like, "Oh, I guess I got to skip that or don't have time for that." It's like, well, you knew how much time you had. It means you didn't practice.
Yeah.
But even besides just the timing thing, if you want to know how it's going to go, in terms of transitions, in terms of pacing, like if it actually sounds good, because writing something and saying something are different, you should practice it out loud beforehand.
And this is especially if you're in the really early on, which I would assume if you're listening to this, you probably are. Like we've been around for a few years, so Dylan, you probably don't do it like I don't know as many times or whatever as you did early on. But if you're getting ready to launch or just launched and newer to preaching, then man, like the first few times I did, this was like it changed my entire message that I was preaching once I gave it out loud, because just the way you think when you write is so much different than when you speak it. And I remember the first time I wrote a message and gave it out loud to nobody, like to myself, it was so clunky, and the transitions I'd get to a point and like want to move on to the next thing and just freeze, like I have no idea how to get to the next thing. And if it was just written out on paper, it would have looked just fine. But if I were to given that to people in front of people, it would have been a disaster. Yeah. And so talking through things for a long period of time, like I still do, honestly. I still do when I preach, and talking through it really helps iron out a lot of issues that you wouldn't know are coming.
Yeah, one of the things that's unfortunate is that we kind of rely on our strengths and don't develop them, and instead just kind of work on all the stuff we're not good at when it's our strengths that really makes the difference. And so if you preach, you're probably a decent-ish communicator.
Sure.
And so it can be easy for you to wait to the last minute to put it together. The better thing to do is to spend your best time, your most focused time, and prioritize your sermon, because A, you're impacting a lot of people.
Yeah.
So that's a big audience. But B, you want to make it better. And so practicing it out loud is not even just for the sermon itself. It's for you to practice and train and become a better communicator. Like for me, when we started, we are a little bit ahead. Like, so I'm not prepping the sermon week of.
Yeah.
But when we started, I was like maybe a week or two ahead, wasn't that far ahead. And so I would do the sermon study, put it together. And then the week of, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I would go over it 4 times. Still probably wasn't that great, but I would go over it 4 times. Now it's changed because I've been doing this pretty much every week for 4 years, where Monday, my process, if it matters, is Monday morning I'll review the sermon that's coming that Sunday and kind of reduce my notes. And then Tuesday and Thursday, I will go over it out loud, like the whole thing, and kind of tweak and that sort of thing. And then I review it again Saturday night for like 20 minutes, and then Sunday morning for like 20 minutes. But I go over it still twice a week, every single week. Because it helps me, again, take transitions out, see what sounds good, what connects, and just writing it on a page and say, I'm going to go for it. It doesn't train you to be a good communicator, and it's just not going to make the sermon as good as it could be if you would go through it out loud, even just once.
Yeah.
So
one thing that was really helpful to me in very early on, and it's not something I do anymore, and probably wouldn't if you've launched and are in a little bit of a rhythm, but I don't know, maybe you will. But if you haven't launched yet, especially, and are not really in the rhythm of preaching, is the times I would go over it out loud, I would do this when, like, on a weekend or something, like Saturday when nobody was in the building, because I would never do it when everyone was around. But I would actually hook up the mic and everything and record myself and listen to it back. And it's not going to be identical to the way you give it, obviously. Most likely you're gonna speak slower when you're alone, not in front of people. But it gave me an idea of how things sounded, because even saying some things that sounded okay, and then I listen back, especially to stories and things like that, and think the way I described it didn't actually make as much sense as I thought it did, or this thing really didn't connect with the rest of the message. And so, especially if you're really new to this and your first handful of times, I would say record it and listen to yourself, listen to the way it sounds, and it'll really help you iron some of these issues out.
I mean, all these points are important, I think, to have a more engaging sermon, but this might be, I don't know, the one that's like, if I said you have to do one of these things, I would do this. No matter your skill level, go through it out loud to make sure that it sounds good and it works well.
Yes.
So that's number 2. Number 3, and this has to do with your screens or your slides or however you do it, is to keep your slides to 1 point per slide. Now, it's different if you have like a scripture, so people maybe are reading the scripture along. But what happens is whenever you put something on your slides or on your screens, people will read everything on the screen before they turn their attention back to you. So if you have a lot of text and a lot of bullet points and a lot of whatever, you're not being heard until people read all of that. And if you have like multiple points that you're going to get to and you haven't got to them yet, they're going to read it before you say it. So by the time you get to it, they've kind of already checked out because they already know what's coming.
Yeah.
So what we would recommend is when you have like sermon points, you have 1 per slide, and you just, you keep it up while you're saying it, then you go to the next slide, or you go back to your sermon graphic or whatever. But keep it 1 point per slide so people can read it. It matches what you're saying. And the benefit of this too is that, for us, we have however many sermon points typically per sermon, is that typically if you make a point, you talk about it for a minute or 2 or whatever, 3 minutes, however long it is.
Yeah.
And you keep that slide up there as long as you're talking about that point. So it also helps people remember like what's happening here if they check out for a second or 2. But keep your slides to 1 point per slide to help people stay engaged.
Yeah, I remember we went to a conference, I think it was this past year, 2020 or maybe 2019.
It was the last conference we attended.
I can't remember if it was the last one or the one before that, but one of the conferences we went to. And there's a speaker's name I won't give, obviously, but he. I remember thinking that the content was good, but the slides were mess, to put it lightly. Like, it was a lot of like bullet pointed slides, and they'd get really long, and then they'd go to something else, then come back to it, and it'd still have all the previous bullets and add something. And I remember thinking afterwards, like, I think that content was good, but I couldn't focus on any of it because I was just always trying to reread to make sure I didn't miss anything. And so it's just one of those things where you might not think it matters that much, but it really does. And just having 1 point, and honestly, the shorter the better. Like, we don't like have a limit we try and keep them to,
right.
But if we can say something in fewer words, we say it in fewer words.
Yep.
And keeping it as short as possible and putting just one thing on the screen at a time, it really helps people engage with that point real quick, but then go back to engaging with you instead of spending all their time just rereading previous points or just spending time looking at the screens. And it allows you to change the screens more often, which helps people re-engage. If you have multiple points and can change things that are on the screens more, it helps people re-engage with that each time and then re-engage with you. So
people check out, they see something change, they look up.
Yep.
As a side note, I guess this could have been another point, but we'll keep it with 1 point per slide. You want to make sure your slide is, we would say this way, simple is better.
Yeah.
So like if you have a background and you put text over a background or a picture, it can be confusing or hard to read, or depending on where the colors are in the background, there might be a letter, and you're like, what? What we do, not saying this is the best thing, but we have like a, I don't want to say like a dark gray. It's not black, but it's like a dark gray for our sermon slides, and we just have white text over the slides, and then we'll have a color. We'll have typically have a word or two that's bolded, and then that bolded word will be colored, and it'll match the series color.
art. Yeah.
But it's very basic because if you have stuff that is moving around and that sort of thing, it's hard to focus. That's different than like worship slides. Worship slides can be a little different. But during a sermon slide, you don't want people's attention focused on confusing things. You want them to look at the screen and then back to the preacher so they can stay engaged.
And as a side note, if you do it this way, which, like I said, not saying it's the greatest way, but we've been doing it for a while, and it's been a lot more effective than the way we did before.
It is. And as a side note, it's really weird. The weeks that I don't preach, like I'm reminded, our screens, they're good.
Yeah.
Like they're basic, but it's like they're very clear. When they say this, it's on there. It's easy to read. It's not distracting.
Yep. I think there's a difference between, I don't even know how to phrase this, but it's basic in a way, but it looks like it's basic on purpose. In other words, it doesn't look like text just typed on there. So a side note, if you ever want to know what it looks like, contact us. We'll send you a picture of it. It's not like it's the greatest thing in the world, but it's super non-distracting, and it's very clear what you're supposed to be looking at.
And big fonts.
Big fonts, big bold fonts.
That's right. So 1 point per slide. Number 4. Now, this might be the most... This is probably the thing that preachers need to be either reminded or coached on the most. We all know it to be true, but it's easy to forget, and that is that you should preach like there are non-believers in the room. So kind of our philosophy at New City is what Tim Keller has said, that he preaches to believers knowing there's non-believers in the room. Yeah. And so this is not to say to quote unquote water down your material or change what you're going to say. You should say what you want to say, but you need to preach as if people are there that have no idea what you're talking about. And it's not so that they understand everything. Like if you have a non-believer and they're new, like they're not going to understand everything. They're going to be confused, and that's okay. But what you want to do is you want to acknowledge that it's okay to not know everything and kind of give them the invitation to sit and not know. So let me give you some examples. If you're preaching, like we're in the book of Exodus. Yeah. Don't just say, open up your Bibles and turn to the book of Exodus. That's not helpful. What you can do super quickly is just say, hey, we're in the book of Exodus. Now, if you do this every week, you can forget. Yeah. And if you're a smaller church, you can be like, well, everyone knows where it is, but even Christians, they don't know where things are. Just say it's the second book of the Bible. It's pretty easy to find. Or if you're doing the Gospel of Matthew. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's the New Testament. It's about 2/3 in. What the thing is, basically what this does is, even if it doesn't tell them exactly where to turn, it gives them the invitation. It lets them know it's okay to try to find it so they don't feel dumb. Now, for us, we have a script. We have Bibles in all the seats, and we put the scripture reference and the page number on the screen, so we don't actually they have to open up their Bible. Yeah. So we don't have to do this every week because there's a page number. It tells them exactly where to go. But if we didn't, that's what we would do. Or if you talk about a biblical character, like you do not want to say, we all know King David. You could say, like, many of us might be familiar with King David, but if you're not, give 1 or 2 biographical details. Not to explain everything, but a new person can be like, I don't know who this is, but that's helpful. And you as a preacher know that there's people like me in the audience because you're trying to help me here.
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, I think it's, and especially like if you're going through a book, like you said, we're going through Exodus. Towards the end of Exodus, especially, like it would be real difficult to every week try and bring every single person completely up to speed as you're talking about like building the tabernacle and things like that. Like, what's the importance of it? But like if it is someone, and I think this even helps people this will help believers as well, because not every believer is as mature of a Christian as each other. And so some of them may need more explanation of what's going on. But so giving some context without spending the entire time just rehashing everything you talked about in the previous weeks, I think is really helpful for non-believers, obviously, because even if you're preaching a message that's more geared towards believers, you don't want them to obviously feel like it was a waste of time coming. And obviously you want them to still be able to get something out of it. But I think it'll help everyone track with you a little bit more as well.
Yep. So again, the stuff that's obvious, like if you say sanctification, just say what that is, because
Yeah.
Christians don't know what that means either. But it's really easy to forget the two things that I found: turning to the Bible and saying we all know, or you mention somebody and nobody knows who that is, or they think that they're the only one who doesn't know when we say things like that. So it's just inviting them and letting them know it's okay if you don't know everything. Of course, it's hard if you're smaller and you feel like everyone in the room knows all these things. But what will happen is they'll be like, well, if I invite my friend, they're going to feel not out of place because they're going to know that not everybody knows, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's good, because if you're smaller, you may know everyone in this room is a believer. You know, if you're smaller and don't have many new people coming. But like you said, if I'm hearing this, and it's especially if I'm a relatively maybe newer believer or something, and if I feel like I'm a little bit lost, I know I'm not going to bring my non-believer friend because he'll be completely lost. And so it's just a matter of kind of towing that line of making sure you can keep people engaged, but without I don't know, pandering to them, if that makes sense.
And there's a challenge sometimes where you might have a sermon that's just very like, if you're a Christian, this applies to you. If you're not, you're not. It doesn't apply as much. But even stuff like that, it's really helpful to say in the beginning, hey, today we're going to be talking about whatever. If you're not a Christian here today, if you're not a follower of Jesus, this might sound weird or difficult. I just want to invite you to just hang out and listen. As we talk about these things, it's okay if some of these things are confusing, just to let them know that they're sitting through this whole sermon and they feel like, what am I supposed to do with this? That you acknowledge that they're there.
Yeah.
And I think it's really helpful, even if most of the content isn't geared towards them.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Acknowledging, I think, takes a lot of the pressure off, because at least then they're not feeling, I mean, honestly, dumb. Like I should be understanding this, but if you give them kind of a little bit of an out of, you may not get everything I'm saying, and that's totally fine. I think that actually helps them engage with you a little bit more.
Yep. And so here's the best piece of advice I could give on how to preach like there are non-believers in the room. Here's what I would do. When you are going over your sermon out loud before Sunday or whenever you do it, imagine, or obviously the day that you do it, imagine one of your really close friends that does not know Jesus, or a family member that does not know Jesus, comes to church for the first time.
Yeah.
And they have no background in church, or they haven't been in years. What would you do differently? You probably wouldn't change your content, but I guarantee you if they walked into that room that Sunday, you would probably give them a little context about where to turn to the Bible.
Yeah.
You would explain any word that sounds confusing, and you wouldn't say things like, well, we all know Moses, because he or she doesn't know Moses.
Yeah.
So that is what I would think of if I have a friend who's coming for the first time and has no idea of this. Yes, he's not going to understand everything, but I do want to give some hints to invite them to stay engaged and let them know we do expect people like you to be here who doesn't know everything, and that's okay. I'll give you some details and then just try to catch up as best you can, but it's okay if you don't know all of these things.
Yeah, that's really good.
That is, again, probably one of the biggest things that I've seen is that we know we should do this, but then we forget. It's, I don't know who coined the phrase, the curse of knowledge, but we forget what it's like not to know. So preach like there are non-believers in the room. The next one, again, you can disagree on this. This is just engaging. Would recommend preaching 35 minutes or less. Now, just to be clear, this is context. Helps a lot. So this is pretty much for like Americans, like an American Western context. It's different other places. So this isn't like a holy or not holy. It's just generally speaking, as Brian said in the beginning, most people, 99% of people are not 1% communicators.
Yeah.
And so the longer you go, people will drown out and not listening. And in fact, you could say, well, what if I preach 30 minutes good and then, what if I preach 40 minutes? First 30 minutes are engaging, last 10 minutes are kind of boring. Well, if you do that, it actually erases like the first 30 minutes. Like it doesn't make it better or okay. Like the longer you go, it's a detriment to everything else that you've said. And it takes more work to go less. Like I remember I was in this church planning cohort a couple years ago, and there was like 10 of us, and we were talking about, we were going around talking about how long we preach, and people were like 45 minutes, 50 minutes. Now, just fair warning, we're a part of Acts 29, so people like to preach long times. It's whatever. It's our culture or whatever. And I think at the time I said 30, and there was like a gasp. I was like, bro, I know some of you guys. You shouldn't be preaching for 50 minutes anyway. Because there's this assumption that longer is better. And if we want to engage people and, actually want them to apply and listen, I mean, we could say, well, you just should listen to the Bible for 50 minutes, although all of us wouldn't listen to a bad communicator for 50 minutes either. So there's that. But you actually want people to take away and be transformed and to do something with what they heard. And if you go too long, you'll just lose it. And in my experience, very few people can keep someone's attention for 40 minutes, so I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah, like you said, that going shorter is harder in many cases. Like the point here is not to unload all the information you can possibly cram in, and everything that you found interesting. It's to communicate effectively of what you're trying to communicate. And so if you can do that in a shorter amount of time and still, obviously, without cutting out the most important things, and still communicate effectively, then shorter is generally better without going to extremes. And especially if you're listening to this, honestly, especially if you're someone who's newer, like planting a church for the first time and newer to this, there's no need to go longer than, I mean, in most cases, I know there's exceptions maybe that I can't think of, but then 35 minutes, unless, I mean, outside of like weird circumstances, but most of us can cut something down to something shorter than that and communicate it more effectively. And if you can't, then maybe it's something where you need to look at the content that you're preaching. If it's something that maybe you're trying to cover too much ground in one week, or if you're just, this might be the kind of thing where you need to get other people's opinion on, but you're trying to make it a little bit more of a lecture than a sermon.
And sometimes I feel bad, like sharing what we've done or what I've done as it's like the gold standard. It's not. But I just know as a church planter, it's helpful to know what other people did. So when we started, my initial like preaching goal was like 25 minutes, which is like short. But I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. And it's probably good, because if I took the skill I had 4 years ago and preached for 35 minutes, it would be boring.
Yeah, for sure.
And then it changed from 25 to 30 minutes, and then it was 30 minutes, and now it's 35 minutes, and that's like my cap. So for me, most weeks I'll try to keep it between 30 to 35 minutes, and it's not going to, even if I continue to get better with whatever, like that's kind of the cap for, especially for our service and service length, and people can do different things, but it's just like, say what you got to say in 35 minutes or less. If it takes you longer, you're not telling people things they're going to remember anyway. So that's what we would recommend, 35 minutes or less.
No, that's good. And I think, people, it's just, people don't stay engaged that long. Like, I mean, I know, especially for myself, completely preaching aside, and this is not obviously the exact same thing, but like when it comes to anything I'm sitting still for, it comes to a movie or a show, I will always lean towards the shorter ones, because it's just, and I had a discussion with someone the other day that there's no such thing as a movie should either be an hour and a half or shorter or over 3 hours. Like, if it's in that middle range, you could cut things out. And that's just the case with a lot of our preaching too. And I'm not trying to say it's like, it's just for entertainment. Obviously, that's not the point. But just people, it's hard to engage people for that amount of time. It's hard for people to sit still for that amount of time. And if you can say something shorter, then I don't think you really need to go to great lengths to just make it longer.
If you have to explain your explanation, that's too much. Just explain it. Now you might be thinking, Dylan, Brian, 35 minutes. Like, how do I do that? Well, this goes to point number 6.
That's right.
Now, point number 6 is not just helpful to reduce your time, but it's a benefit. And that is to include others in the sermon writing or the creation process.
Yes.
Now, to do this, you have to be ahead. All you have to be ahead is like a week, though, or you could do it early on in your week if you want to. And I get it's different if you don't have a staff or if you're small and who to talk to or whatever. But what we do at New City Church is a couple weeks ahead, 4 to 5 to 6 weeks ahead, something like that, is what I am on like writing the sermon. And then at some point, a few weeks before the sermon gets there, it's definitely before week of, we have what we call message collab. So every week we're going over a sermon. I'll talk through. Of course, if someone else is preaching, they'll do it too. But I'll talk through my sermon. I won't give it, and everyone will have all of my notes, and it's really helpful. Sometimes there's not a lot of feedback, but it's helpful to know, like, oh, this isn't crazy. But B, it's also helpful for stories, which we'll talk about the importance of that, and illustrations. C, it's helpful to like the points. Are they too long? Are they confusing? Does this word make sense? D, it helps. I don't know why am I doing this alphabet thing? I don't know. D, it helps you cut it down, because there are times where it's like, this is confusing, or this takes away, or I don't really see how this helps what you're trying to say. But having a process that you can talk through your sermon beforehand, before you give it, gives you the confidence that it's better than it would have been, and it allows other people with different perspectives to give you feedback on it, which is super valuable.
Yeah, outside of practicing out loud, I think this one is the biggest deal. Was the biggest deal for me, and still is, because it's just hard having only your own voice. Like, you just need other people to weigh in, especially in the early stages. But I mean, we still do this now, so I mean, I think it's valuable.
And in fact,
definitely,
I would even say it's even, to me personally, it's even more valuable to me now than it was 3 years ago. Even though I probably needed it more 3 years ago than I needed it now.
Interesting. You need to get other people's opinion on it, and for a million different reasons, like Dylan mentioned. Like, it helps you not just be more effective in communicating, and helps things become clear, but you'll discover when when things just make sense in your head and aren't
Yep.
making sense out loud. And there's just a lot of things, especially if you're preaching through books of the Bible, you can really easily run into assuming people know backgrounds, assuming
Yep.
people already know things, or dumping in a lot of just interesting tidbits that don't
Right.
really need to be there, and they're just hard to catch on your own, especially if you're the one that thinks it's interesting. And so getting other people to weigh in, whether it's a staff, whether it's friends or other pastors, whatever it is, I think is probably going to be one of the most helpful things you can do if you don't already.
And this really takes a lot of the stress off, because we all know there's
Yeah.
times we're like, does this make sense? Does this sound good? And instead of like just hoping it does, like for me, knowing when I write a sermon that this is going to have feedback, it makes me not stress out as much, because I'm
Yeah.
like, people are going to hear this before time, so they're going to give me feedback. So I'm going to know, like, I don't have to spend 30 minutes on this one point if it's confusing. Like,
Yeah.
this seems kind of confusing to me. I'll talk about it with them. But in fact, it's so important, that back in December, we were going to go back into our Exodus series, because we took a break for December, and then we decided to do a brief topical series to start 2021. And so I was like ahead on Exodus, but I wasn't ahead on these sermons.
Yeah.
And so it kind of got like our message collab was what we call it, out of whack. And so it was like Christmas, it was like December 21st or 22nd.
Sure.
And we don't have services the last Sunday in the last week of the year. This whole staff gets off. So I like called everybody. I was like, can we like jump on Zoom and do message collab for this sermon that's happening in a couple weeks? Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to do it.
Yeah.
Because I was like, it was on, what did we do this past week? Not
Spiritual
relationships.
disciplines.
Spiritual disciplines, spiritual practices. And I was like, this just seems boring. Can you? And so it just was so helpful. Interestingly, we didn't end up changing too much, but it gave me so much more confidence when I gave the sermon this past week, knowing that this is not as bad or boring as I thought it was.
Yeah.
Because we all know what it's like preaching a sermon and being like, I don't think this is going to be any good. Now, typically, however you think it goes, a lot of times you think it's going to be worse than it is anyway.
True.
But it's helpful knowing that going in that it's not as bad as you thought it was going to be, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and it helps just having people be able to point out things to work on. Like and especially if you do this consistently, you'll probably notice that you may have consistent things to work on, and which will help you obviously down the road and help you kind of develop your writing and your communicating if you're constantly having the same issues of there's too much detail here, or there's not enough detail here, obviously could happen too. And so it's just making sure to always include others, and not just like in a sporadic sense, but every week, I think is really helpful.
Yep. Now, there's lots of different ways that you can do like feedback and like how you get people to help you like write your messages. How we have done it, we've tried it different ways. How we do it now is you have the person, like if I'm preaching, I'll do the whole sermon myself, and then I will talk it through with everybody, and they'll give feedback. We've tried different ways where like groups, like as a group, we'll try to like write the points together, or like we'll study on our own and talk about the stuff that we learned. And that, to me at least, wasn't very helpful, because as the preacher, you're the one that has to give the sermon.
Yeah.
And if you're not excited about it and like into it, and you're just saying things that other people told you to say, it just doesn't have the same umph behind it.
Yeah.
And it's awkward too if like people disagree on what the point should be.
Yeah.
And so we found that have the person, at least how we do it, if you're preaching, you're the one that does all the studying and all the points. Now people can give you feedback on like that was confusing, or if they have insight into the passage they want to share with you. But we would recommend, at least how we've done it, is you do all the work and then you just get feedback on it. That's how it's worked for us.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful. It may sound kind of weird, but it's helpful that the rest of us don't necessarily do the study on it, or the people that aren't given the message. Now, obviously, we've been listening to the series and have some background knowledge, but we don't come in with having already prepared for that specific that specific passage. And I think it helps those that aren't giving the message kind of realize if it's confusing or not. Because if we came in knowing everything and Dylan says this is what I'm going to go through, well, it's probably not going to be that confusing because we've been studying it as well. But if we haven't been, then we can point out like if I didn't already know this, I'd be really confused. And so,
or if there's like a verse or a word that caught your attention that I didn't talk about, but other people be like, I don't, can you, like they'll get stuck on it if you don't say something about it. So all that to say, include others in the sermon writing process. It's just really helpful. It's awkward in the beginning. Like for me, I was like, just kind of did it because I had to. And now it's like, I mean, it is. I mean, when you put effort into something and then people have to critique it, it's like not fun necessarily. But I feel like I couldn't preach if I didn't have it now.
Yeah,
so
it's really
even though I'm a better preacher than I was when we started, it's just really helpful. So,
Yep.
And this goes to the last point, and this can help you with the last point, is that you should include and I'll probably even say not even this does not count the story that you start with.
Mm,
2 to
yep.
3 sermons or stories or good illustrations in each sermon. In my opinion, at least for me, the hardest thing is not studying the Bible and talking about here's what this means, whatever. The hardest part is keeping people engaged and thinking of relevant stories to help bring people back in. What happens is, even if you only preach for 30 minutes and nobody's going to listen for the entire 30 minutes, very few people, people are going to check out. When someone starts telling a story, it's always an invitation to re-engage because we all like listening to stories. And so if you have really good content, but you're boring people or they're just like, their brains don't get, I don't know, call it like a break for like a few minutes or 30 seconds, it can be hard for them to keep following along. And so the hardest part I have found is to include multiple stories and illustrations throughout. You don't have to have a story for like every point. You don't even have to have a story like every 5 minutes. But if you're going 30, 35 minutes, if you want to include the initial one, I would say you need 3 to 4 to give people the ability to re-engage. Stories are hard to think of sometimes, which is why it's really good to do it with other people. Now, the best stories you can share are your own personal stories. And so there will be some times when I'm writing the sermon, whatever, and I'll include like, I need a story here, and I'll talk about the type of story. And so someone on our staff might share how they did this, but then it'll help me think of a time that I might have done it.
Yeah.
So I might say, for example, a time I didn't listen to my parents. Now that's pretty easy. There's plenty of times I could think of, but there might be a certain illustration to help prove a point. Even if you can't think of one in the moment, you can write it down. And as you talk through the sermon with somebody, they might have an example, or they might have a different type of story that you could tell.
Yeah.
But you need to include stories because otherwise people will not be with you the whole time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's just goes back to the last point of how important this message collab is, because it's, I mean, especially if you do this every week, like I mean, you can attest to more than I can, but it's hard to think of stories all the time. Like, it's just hard to think of relevant stories to not repeat them if you've been doing this for a while.
Especially because you're talking to the same people.
Yeah, very true. So in doing this message collab and just having in there, like you said, just points where it's, if you can't think of a story, just need a story here relating to this idea. It really helps other people, the rest of us that are helping out, think of stories as well, and help, not necessarily, like you said, like it doesn't work to tell a story from someone else's life unless it is like a well-known thing. I don't know. It really never works. But they can tell you something that might jog something in your memory, or might help you think of something that relates to yourself. And so it's it can be tough, but yeah, that's the most engaging thing. And you've said this before, and I don't know if this is I think it's a good thing, whether you consider it a good thing or a bad thing, but that, and I've had this happen too, where people after a message will mention to me like a day or two later about, they'll mention more about a story I told than about any point. Is that a good or bad thing? I don't know. But it means that they engaged with something. And so I count that as a win. It means, I mean, obviously I don't want people to remember a story more than they remember the actual scripture, what we're talking about, but I'd rather them remember something than nothing. And so if someone will come to me a couple days later and reference a story I told, or wait online. Like, for example, you can't see now, I have a tattoo that I've told the story about while preaching. And it's dumb, and it's a little like non-thing, but I've had people for months mention the tattoo. And so at least it connected with something in there. And do they always remember how exactly that connected? I don't know, because I barely do. It was a long time ago. But it at least gives them something to remember, and hopefully something to connect with.
So that's what's helpful. So you want to include 2 to 3 stories or illustrations throughout your sermon if you want it to be more engaging. This is, in my opinion, really hard to do, but if we want people not to just sit there and listen, but actually, impact them, stories are like the best way to do that.
And no matter how much someone's paying attention, you're not going to have a full 100% focus for 35 minutes. Like, people go in and out, something happens that distracts them. And so regardless of how their attention is kind of ebbing and flowing, the story will help bring them back in, and at least you have their attention for another few minutes.
So there you go. Those are 7 things you can do to preach more engaging sermons. Again, if you want to get on the Practical Church Planting launch team for the Growing Your Launch Team course, I'm trying to say.
The launch team for the launch team course.
Practicalplanting.com/course. Sorry, practicalplanting.com/launch. Not course, /launch. You can get all the details there. Get in it now, where you'll get first access, and it will be cheaper than it will ever be otherwise. Obviously, we're putting it together, so we believe it's going to be helpful. But I would say, I could tell you with a straight face, I would spend $149 for this 4 to 5 years ago when we were planting this church.
Yeah,
if I had someone that could just give me not just philosophy and theology, but what should I do, especially if you don't have a lot of relationships to ask help from. So, practicalplanting.com/launch. Thanks for listening, and we'll be with you next time on Practical Church Planting.